December 24th, 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. Night settles heavy over the pine forests, the air damp with a winter chill that never quite becomes snow. A single guard tower lamp cuts through the darkness, its circle of light swaying gently as a soldier shifts his weight, rifle slung across his chest. Beyond the barbed wire, a cluster of wooden barracks stands silent, their windows glowing faintly like embers trying not to fade. Inside Barrack 12, whispers carry in German, soft, tired, and unmistakably female voices. Women who once walked city streets in tailored coats now lie under coarse army blankets, the smell of disinfectant still clinging to their skin. Some stare at the ceiling, trying to remember the warmth of home. Others clutch photographs of husbands or brothers swallowed by a war oceans away. A distant bell rings. The women lean up, exchanging uncertain glances. Christmas Eve. Yet no church, no candles, no choir. Only America's watchful eyes and a war that refuses to sleep. This night, like so many in these camps, will be full of questions. And the world outside these fences is already shifting in ways that will turn their captivity into a headline none of them could ever imagine. By late 1942, as the war expanded across continents, a new and unexpected flow of people crossed the Atlantic under the watch of armed escorts. They were prisoners, mostly men at first, but eventually also women. Nurses, auxiliary workers, civilian volunteers swept up in the chaos of collapsing German positions. Their fate would collide with a country that, until recently, had watched the war from afar. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States debated its role, weighed its distance, and clung to the hope that Europe's war could remain Europe's burden. But once the attack of December 7, 1941, carved its date into history, America mobilized at a pace unmatched. War plants roared awake, millions enlisted, bases mushroomed across the heartland. And with victory in North Africa during 1943, the U.S. suddenly found itself responsible for tens of thousands of Axis POWs, with more expected. The looming question, where to put them? The Geneva Convention of 1929, though imperfect, provided rules. POWs must be sheltered, fed, allowed letters home, and protected from violence. The U.S. military, fearing German retaliation against American captives, took the rules seriously. So, in rural states, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, Louisiana, new compounds rose quietly behind barbed wire and watchtowers. Camp Ruston, Camp Swift, Camp Aliceville, and dozens more became names hardly known outside wartime America, yet they housed entire battalions in captivity. But not every prisoner had worn a uniform. As Germany's war machine struggled, the Nazi state increasingly relied on women, not in frontline roles, but as signals experts, Red Cross auxiliaries, medics, clerks, and civilians drafted into military supply networks. Captured in Italy, France, and the collapsing edges of North Africa, some were sent across the sea, classified as female enemy personnel accompanying the German armed forces. To American civilians, the idea of German women behind fences stirred unease, even fascination. Newspaper headlines framed them as Hitler girls or Nazi maidens, mixing threat with curiosity. Some Americans feared espionage. Others imagined these women as brainwashed symbols of a ruthless enemy. Yet, when they arrived, many looked simply tired, young, frightened, their uniforms more practical than ideological. Still, these were women of the Third Reich. Some had passed through Nazi indoctrination, carrying pride in uniformed service. Others merely followed orders under a regime that allowed no refusal. Packed aboard Liberty ships, seasickness replacing certainty, they crossed an ocean they never expected to see, only to emerge under the stark sunlight of an unfamiliar land. Their new reality was a paradox. They were prisoners, yet treated better than many European civilians under occupation. America fed them well to uphold international law and to avoid German reprisals. Inside the wire, they studied English, worked in camp hospitals, and nursed dreams of going home. Outside the wire, curious locals whispered about them in diners and church halls. The war was shifting, and soon the fate of these women would shift with it. By 1944, the United States held more than 400,000 Axis POWs scattered across nearly every region. Camps became small hidden worlds within the American landscape. Farmers in Texas watched German captives harvest cotton. In Utah, prisoners built irrigation ditches. In Louisiana and Arkansas, timber companies used them to cut lumber. Every step, every task was overseen by guards who often seemed more bored than fearful, especially when their charges were young women with minimal military training. Yet inside the camps, life was ruled by hierarchy. Among the German male POWs, Nazi loyalists enforced discipline, even violence, to maintain ideological control. For women, the dynamic was subtler but still rigid. Those who had served in the Wehrmacht auxiliaries or Bund Deutscher Mädel carried themselves with fierce pride, bearing eagle insignias or carefully preserved service papers. Others, seamstresses, medical assistants, translators, found themselves swept into a structure they had never chosen. Camp officials struggled to understand how to treat these women. They were neither soldiers in frontline units nor civilians with no connection to the war. The Geneva Convention recognized them as members of the enemy armed forces, entitled to camp privileges. Yet their presence raised sensitive questions about privacy, safety, and social order. Separate housing, guarded exterior latrines, limited contact with male POWs. Every detail had to be managed for both propriety and security. Meanwhile, back in Germany, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels crafted a narrative of virtuous German women abused by the Allies. Radio broadcasts warned that surrender meant dishonor or worse. For the women already in American custody, these claims fueled anxiety. What would their families think? Would they be branded traitors for surviving captivity too comfortably? Curiously, many American guards found themselves disarmed by the prisoners' ordinary humanity. Some spoke English. Some sang operatic lullabies through the barracks at night. Some laughed at jokes in broken idioms learned from U.S. newspapers. And slowly, the enemy behind the wire became a study in contradiction. Someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's sister, dressed in field gray. Still, war does not soften for sentiment. Every decision, including what food was served, when music was allowed, how days were scheduled, reflected the tension between law, morality, and the belief that these captives represented the ideology America was fighting to destroy. As 1945 approached, the U.S. War Department faced a new concern: public perception. Reports circulated that German POWs, especially women, were eating better than rationed American families. Beneath that rumor lay a mix of fear and envy, stirring resentment where curiosity once existed. A single event would soon ignite that resentment into outrage. A meticulously arranged meal in southern Louisiana, intended as diplomacy but remembered as scandal. An event later called the Royal Banquet. Angle 1, the human perspective. To the German women behind the barbed wire, captivity was not a single experience, but thousands of private reckonings. Some had enlisted with conviction, proud servants of a rising empire. Others merely stumbled into war, volunteering as nurses or clerical aides, hoping to escape bombed streets and hunger. Their capture stripped away national confidence. Now each woman confronted a life paused, cut from familiar routines. Letters from home arrived slowly, if at all. Rumors filled the void. Hamburg burning, brothers drafted into doomed battles, parents relocated, hopes turned to ash. Inside the camp, small rituals became lifelines. A wooden comb passed between beds, a shared bar of soap, songs sung quietly in the dark, harmonies floating above the fear. There were quarrels, too, political divisions that did not vanish simply because the Reich was an ocean away. Some demanded absolute loyalty to Hitler. Others whispered doubts in corners. In that confined space, even kindness became complicated. Gratitude toward American guards felt like disloyalty. Moments of laughter felt like betrayal of suffering Europe. Most of all, they lived with the knowledge that survival did not guarantee welcome back home. And while the war's thunder was distant, their identities were still prisoners of a regime that claimed their hearts even after losing their hands. Angle 2. The Tactical and Administrative Perspective for the U.S. War Department. POWs were both obligation and burden. Each camp required guards, food, uniforms, medical care, all at a time when American families faced ration books and empty shelves. The military recorded every detail: calories served, work hours assigned, outbreaks of illness, discipline events. These controls were not merely bureaucracy. They signaled compliance with the Geneva Convention and shielded American POWs in German hands from retaliation. Female POWs introduced challenges unfamiliar to most officers. They needed separate quarters and sanitary facilities. They could not be assigned heavy labor typical for male prisoners, limiting their economic usefulness. Many were given clerical tasks, laundry work, or hospital support within designated areas. Transport protocols added further complexity. Different escorts, privacy measures, and constant monitoring to prevent fraternization. American commanders walked a fine line. Generosity could be seen as weakness. Harshness could spark diplomatic crisis. The German High Command demanded detailed welfare reports, and the International Red Cross visited frequently to verify treatment. The result? A strange form of guarded dignity. Prisoners fed white bread, while some American towns rationed meat. As tension rose, it became clear that even one misjudged act, especially one involving the comfort or luxury of female captives, could fracture public trust and ignite political outrage. Angle 3. Technological and identification. Perspective processing prisoners required far more than a ledger and a head count. Each woman carried papers, identification cards, service booklets, sometimes forged documents. American intelligence officers examined everything: unit stamps, radio training certificates, medical corps insignias, communications badges. Those with technical specialties, especially in signals or code work, were questioned cautiously. The Allies feared espionage and sabotage even within the camps, and the presence of German female radio operators raised alarms. Their captured equipment, field telephones, typewriters, encrypted notes, prompted analysts to map networks of the German war machine. Yet the women themselves were often terrified of speaking, wary of betraying secrets that could doom loved ones still in uniform. Technology revealed loyalty, vulnerability, and knowledge, all hidden behind eyes that once believed their Reich could never be breached. Angle 4. Leadership and Policy Perspective. For American officers, the female POW question was political as much as procedural. Washington's orders emphasized strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, equal rations to U.S. troops, access to exercise yards, medical care without discrimination. Commanders understood the stakes. German propaganda was waiting for mistakes. Each officer, whether in Ruston, Texas, or the Carolinas, had to ensure that these women remained safe from abuse, exploitation, or public spectacle. At the same time, they faced pressure to demonstrate that prisoners were not being pampered. Senators received angry letters from families asking why enemy women had citrus fruit when their own children could not. Thus, command decisions were made in the narrow space where law, ethics, and domestic anger collided. A space so fragile that even a celebratory meal could be seen as a national insult. Angle 5. Moral and Social Perspective. Across small-town America, opinions about the German women shifted with economy, rumor, and wartime fatigue. Farmers working beside POWs sometimes treated them with surprising kindness, offering extra lunch scraps or casual conversation through fences. But many civilians saw only the emblem on their sleeves, not the person beneath. Church groups worried about the morality of allowing young enemy women so close to U.S. soldiers. Newspapers fed the anxiety, printing remarks about Hitler's maidens dining like royalty in Louisiana. Even the hint of luxury, soap with scent, towels without patches, a slice of cake, could stir resentment among families counting ration stamps. In this atmosphere, hospitality became suspicion, and humane treatment became controversy. As the war's end came into view and victory felt close enough to taste, emotions sharpened and tolerance thinned. A single event, one night of elevated charity, was all it would take to turn uneasy acceptance into public fury. And that night was coming. April 7, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. 1640 hours on the parade ground. The sun hung low, casting long stripes of shadow between the barracks. A small convoy arrived at the main gate, one staff car leading a truck covered in canvas tarps. Inside the car, Captain Richard Harrison, camp adjutant, reviewed a set of neatly typed orders stamped with the War Department seal. The directive came straight from Washington. Provide demonstration of compliance with Geneva Convention standards for female POWs during the upcoming international inspection. It sounded simple enough, yet the timing was perilous. Victory in Europe seemed imminent. American sacrifice weighed heavy, and rationing made every spare ounce of sugar a luxury. Few hours in the mess hall reserved for POW women. Cooks placed white tablecloths over rough wooden tables. Not pristine linen, just clean sheets trimmed from surplus hospital supplies. But to anyone watching, they looked extravagant. Soldiers carried trays, roast chicken, potatoes, fruit preserved in syrup. At the center of each table, a small vase holding a single wildflower gathered from outside the wire. The women, about 30 in number, entered in orderly lines. Their uniforms were plain, insignias stripped months ago. Yet something like memory straightened their posture. A glimpse of life before capture. 20 hours among them was Obergefreiter Anna Klein, 23 years old, once a communications clerk near Naples. She paused as she passed through the doorway, stunned by the brightness of the room. A piano stood polished against the wall. An army band sergeant sat ready with sheet music. The guards, too, looked uneasy, as if unsure whether they were hosting a celebration or testing fate. Captain Harrison knew eyes beyond the camp would notice tonight. A photographer from the War Department Public Relations Office stood quiet near the entrance, camera hanging like a silent judge. Tour hours, dinner began. Forks clinked against real plates, not metal trays. Some women cautiously tasted the unfamiliar sweetness of canned peaches. Others exchanged timid glances, wondering if this kindness came with strings attached. Intelligence questions, loyalty tests, propaganda. No one felt truly comfortable, least of all the American officers. Outside the mess hall windows, local workers, those assigned to transport and groundskeeping, stole glances. Whispers passed faster than the evening wind. Steak, fresh bread, flowers on the tables. The idea spread. Enemy women feasting like royalty. Not the soldiers bleeding in Europe. Not the families struggling through rationing. Inside, the piano music softened the tension. Anna Klein lowered her fork, listening. A familiar Schubert melody. Her eyes warmed. and for one fragile moment, she remembered home. Then a door banged open. A corporal rushed to Captain Harrison's side, breath ragged. "Sir, civilians at the gate. Angry. Someone spread word about the meal." Harrison's stomach tightened. The photographers froze. The music faltered into silence. What began as compliance with international law was about to turn into a public scandal, one that would follow these women long after they sailed home. 20 hours, Sector. Sound outside grew louder, angry shouts rising beyond the perimeter fence. At first, the women thought it was part of the camp's routine, but then a glass bottle shattered against the outer wall of the mess hall. Anna Klein and others flinched, instinctively ducking. Guards rushed past the windows, weapons slung forward, eyes narrowed into the dusk. The piano lid slammed shut. Captain Harrison stepped toward the door, jaw locked. A second corporal reported in hurried whispers, "Sir, they're locals. Around 40 of them. Some are demanding answers. Others want the camp commander out here. Word is, Nazi women eating better than our boys." Harrison's pulse drummed hot in his ears. The photographer lowered his camera, realizing these frames would never make the newspapers, not without inflaming every patriotic nerve in America. 25 hours Camp Commandant Colonel James Whitaker, a career officer hardened by 2 decades of service, stormed into the hall. He took one look at the nervous faces, both prisoners and guards, and understood instantly that the evening was over. "This ends now," he ordered. Soldiers swept the tables, removing vases and dishes before the women had finished their first course. The band sergeant packed his sheet music, avoiding eye contact. The blankets disguised as tablecloths were yanked away so quickly they bunched into wrinkled heaps. The German women stood silently, hands clasped, some trembling with confusion. Hospitality had turned into humiliation within minutes. 40 hours, Whitaker ordered escorts to return the women to their barracks under double guard. The clatter of boots on concrete echoed like a closing verdict. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the fence, voices sharper now, accusations, curses, the crackle of torches and car headlights mingling in the night. As Anna Klein passed the window, she looked out and saw something she had not seen since capture. Civilians openly hating her. The barbed wire didn't simply imprison her. It shielded her from the fury America saved for its enemies. 5 hours. Inside the command office, phones rang relentlessly. Washington demanded a report. The International Red Cross requested assurance of safety. Local police wanted to avoid bloodshed. Whitaker's hands shook slightly as he signed the incident log. Every detail would be scrutinized later. Captain Harrison stood beside him, face pale. "Sir, what about the photographs?" Whitaker didn't hesitate. "Lock them away. None leave this camp." Outside, the crowd slowly dispersed under police warning. But the damage had already spread, carried in rumors, fueled by righteous anger. Civilians returned home telling stories of lavish feasts and prisoner queens. Newspapers would soon sharpen those images into headlines. 10 hours back in Barrack the 12, the women lay awake staring at the dark ceiling. The sweetness of canned peaches still lingered on their tongues, a reminder of a kindness the world refused to allow. Short meal meant to prove America's adherence to the Geneva Convention had instead exposed a raw truth. War defines not only how nations fight, but how they feed and who deserves comfort. The royal banquet was over. Its consequences were only beginning. The fallout began before the women fell asleep that night. Within 24 hours, the confrontation at Camp Ruston reached the desks of senior officers across 3 states. Local newspapers seized the story with indignation sharpened into headlines. Hitler's women dine better than our boys overseas. Ruston Times, April 8, 1945 reporters described platters piled high like victory parades and prisoners treated as honored guests. No mention was made of the women's confusion or the hasty removal of the tables. Photographs never released to the public were replaced by exaggerated illustrations, silk dresses, chandeliers, silver goblets. Truth became irrelevant. What mattered was anger, and anger sold papers. Citizens wrote furious letters to city halls and to Congress. One Louisiana resident demanded that every scrap of food spoiled on those Nazis should be taken from their mouths. Another parent asked why his son, wounded in Germany, was eating powdered eggs while German women enjoyed roast chicken in America. In Washington, the War Department took notice. A special inspection board was dispatched to Camp Ruston to determine whether the meal constituted excessive privilege. Colonel Whitaker defended his decisions calmly, pointing to the Geneva Convention mandate and inspection order from higher command. But the board cared less about legality and more about optics. They recommended swift action to avoid future perceptions of imbalance. 3 immediate measures followed. The cancellation of all enhanced meals and entertainment for POWs, especially females, tightened ration scales to ensure POWs visibly received no items scarce to U.S. civilians. Censorship of camp events that could be interpreted as generosity or celebration. German female POWs at Ruston, around 40 in total by spring 1945, found themselves suddenly under harsher scrutiny. Work assignments increased. Recreation time decreased. Guards received explicit warnings to maintain emotional and physical distance. Yet there were limits to punishment. U.S. policy still required humane treatment. An internal memorandum reminded commanders, "We must remember, the eyes of the world are upon how we treat those in our custody." War Department Circular, April 1945. No formal disciplinary action was taken against Captain Harrison or Colonel Whitaker. Both men followed orders, and Washington recognized the irony. The scandal had erupted from America's attempt to prove it followed international law. Still, reputations suffered. The term royal banquet became a whisper in military halls, a cautionary tale about how quickly moral correctness can be mistaken for treason in wartime. Meanwhile, inside the wire, the women felt the shift most intensely. What had briefly appeared as dignity returned to routine austerity. Tin trays, coarse bread, silent meals. They exchanged glances that asked the same unspoken question. Why did kindness feel like a crime? The answer would emerge slowly, through changing policies and post-war interrogations that reshaped the fate of these women after the guns finally fell silent. In the months that followed, Camp Hearn's Royal Banquet became a case study cited in internal U.S. Army memoranda as a warning on cultural misreading. For administrators, the incident highlighted a paradox. The more autonomy granted to POWs, especially officers, the more they could recreate the very hierarchies and nationalist rituals that the war was being fought to defeat. Reports submitted to the Provost Marshal General stressed that German officers, even those technically stranded on the sidelines, still saw themselves as guardians of the Third Reich's ideological prestige. Permitting them to host elaborate ceremonies risked turning U.S.-run camps into stages for Nazi pageantry. The War Department issued revised guidelines governing POW events. Decorations would be screened for political symbols. Observances required explicit oversight, and no ceremonies were to suggest royalty, state power, or continuing allegiance to Axis regimes. Hearn's banquet had not been illegal, but it had revealed a gray zone within the Geneva Convention concerning morale activities. The U.S. opted to narrow that gray area. For the civilian population around Hearn, the episode deepened contrasts between propaganda and reality. Newspapers had long depicted Germans as fanatical warriors. Yet, those at Herne seemed more like high-spirited detainees, enjoying privileges that struggling Texans, still recovering from the Depression and wartime shortages, could barely imagine. The royalty story became a talking point. Why should the enemy dine at long tables while American families rationed butter? This discontent influenced subtle policy shifts, fewer supplies for ornamental events, and increased emphasis on labor projects, where POWs contributed visibly to U.S. wartime productivity, repairing roads, clearing brush, harvesting cotton. The government wanted locals to see the camps as assets, not burdens or spectacles. For the German women, meanwhile, the banquet's aftermath triggered a quiet arc of disillusionment. Many had clung to internal military hierarchy to preserve identity and dignity. But once labeled troublemakers and dispersed to less comfortable facilities, they faced a harsher U.S. system without familiar allies. Letters intercepted by censors showed declining morale. The banquet that was supposed to affirm their elitism became instead a demonstration of their vulnerability in Allied custody. Historians later debated the German officers' motives. Were they merely reenacting tradition to bolster morale, fully allowed under the Geneva Rules? Or was this an act of symbolic defiance, intentionally elevating a prisoner into a queen to suggest that Hitler's order still carried weight even in defeat? Records do not prove a grand conspiracy. Yet the U.S. officers' reaction showed that symbols mattered, especially at a moment when the Allies were trying to dismantle Nazism, not just militarily, but culturally. By 1946, most participants from Herne had been repatriated to a Germany both physically devastated and politically decapitated. Their memories of that night, half absurdity, half rebellion, persisted in post-war interviews as a strange reminder that even inside fences, POWs could momentarily resurrect a vanished world. American officials, looking back, concluded that the banquet had not endangered national security, but it had exposed the fragility of control in a system built on cooperation and oversight rather than brute force. Thus, the legacy of the royal banquet was not one of violence or scandal, but of administrative clarity. It forced the U.S. to recognize that war does not end at surrender. It continues in rituals, identities, and the invisible fight over meaning. In that sense, the evening when a German prisoner became a queen was a turning point, the moment when stagecraft met statecraft, and the army realized that theater itself could be a battlefield. History often remembers the Second World War through its grand battles and world leaders, the vast machinery of conflict measured in fleets and fronts. Yet, sometimes the most revealing moments occur far from the gunfire, in quiet places like a Texas prairie, where war collided with ordinary life in unexpected ways. The royal banquet at Camp Herne did not change the outcome of the war, nor did it alter the fate of nations, but it exposed something deeply human. When stripped of power, home, and certainty, people cling to identity, even if that identity must be rebuilt from tablecloths and borrowed dignity. For the U.S., it was a lesson in the politics of control. Victory is not merely the silencing of guns, but the careful management of meaning, preventing the defeated from turning nostalgia into rebellion. For the German prisoners, it was a fleeting assertion that the world they knew had not vanished, that hierarchy, ceremony, and pride might still survive behind barbed wire. And for local Americans, it illuminated the uncomfortable contradictions of a war fought for freedom, while the enemy sometimes lived more freely than themselves. Today, Camp Herne stands mostly silent, its stories weathered into the soil. But the banquet remains a reminder that war continues wherever memory and authority struggle over the past. Even a single dinner, improvised, harmless, half-comedic, can reveal how fiercely people defend the symbols that tell them who they are.